The weeks following the barn fire marked a subtle but significant change in Sarah and Jake's relationship. Their interactions remained outwardly similar, but both seemed more aware of the deeper connection that had been acknowledged without being formally declared. Jake continued his regular visits to the clinic, but now Sarah found herself looking forward to these appointments with an anticipation that went beyond mere friendship. During one of their lunch meetings in late October, Sarah mentioned that she had been considering expanding her practice to include large animal services, which would require significant equipment upgrades and facility modifications. Jake listened thoughtfully as she outlined her plans and concerns about the financial investment required. "Sounds like a solid business idea," Jake said. "This area could use a vet who specializes in livestock. Most folks have to drive clear to San Antonio for anything beyond basic care." "The problem is the startup costs," Sarah explained. "I need to build proper facilities for treating large animals, buy specialized equipment, and probably hire additional staff. It's a big risk." Jake was quiet for several minutes, clearly thinking through what she had shared. Finally, he spoke carefully. "If you decide to move forward with it, I know some contractors who do quality work at fair prices, and there are grants available for expanding rural veterinary services that you might qualify for." Over the following days, Jake appeared with information about funding opportunities, contact details for equipment suppliers, and even rough sketches of facility layouts that would maximize efficiency while minimizing construction costs. His research was thorough and thoughtful, clearly representing hours of work that he had done on his own time. "You didn't need to do all this research for me," Sarah said as she reviewed the materials he had compiled. "Wanted to," Jake replied simply. "Your success matters to me." The straightforward honesty of his statement resonated with Sarah more powerfully than any romantic declaration might have. Jake wasn't trying to impress her with grand gestures or clever words. He was simply demonstrating through his actions that her goals and happiness had become genuinely important to him. As November progressed, Sarah made the decision to move forward with expanding her practice. Jake became an informal advisor throughout the planning process, offering practical insights about construction logistics and local business considerations. He never tried to take control of her decisions, but rather provided information and support that helped her make better choices. The construction phase began in early December, with Jake frequently stopping by to monitor progress and offer suggestions to the contractors. Sarah was impressed by his knowledge of building techniques and his ability to communicate effectively with the work crews. When problems arose, as they inevitably did with any construction project, Jake helped troubleshoot solutions without creating additional stress for Sarah. During this busy period, their relationship continued to evolve in ways that felt natural and unforced. Jake began staying for dinner on evenings when Sarah worked late at the clinic, bringing takeout from local restaurants and helping her catch up on administrative tasks that piled up during busy days. These informal dinners became a cherished part of Sarah's routine, providing both practical assistance and emotional support during a demanding time. One evening in mid-December, as they sat in Sarah's office reviewing contractor invoices and equipment specifications, Sarah realized how completely Jake had become integrated into both her professional and personal life. His presence felt essential rather than optional, and she couldn't imagine navigating the expansion project without his steady support and practical wisdom. "I don't know what I would have done without your help through all of this," Sarah said, gesturing toward the construction plans spread across her desk. Jake looked up from the paperwork he was reviewing, meeting her eyes directly for one of the few times since they'd known each other. "You would have managed just fine," he said quietly. "You're stronger and more capable than you realize." The confidence in his voice surprised Sarah. She had never thought of herself as particularly strong or capable, especially when dealing with major business decisions and construction projects that were outside her expertise. But Jake's assessment wasn't offered as flattery or encouragement. It was stated as simple fact based on his observations of her character over many months. "Thank you for believing in me," Sarah said softly. "Easy to believe in someone when you see them giving their best to everything they do," Jake replied, returning his attention to the paperwork with characteristic modesty. The construction project was completed just before Christmas, with the new large animal facilities ready for operation after the holidays. Jake had been present for the final inspections, ensuring that every detail met Sarah's specifications and local regulations. As the contractors cleaned up their equipment and prepared to leave, Sarah stood in her expanded clinic feeling both proud of what she had accomplished and grateful for the support that had made it possible. "Looks like you're ready for the next chapter," Jake observed, surveying the completed facilities with obvious satisfaction. "We're ready," Sarah corrected, the pronoun slipping out before she had consciously decided to use it. Jake turned to look at her, and, for a moment, the careful reserve that usually characterized his demeanor seemed to soften. He repeated quietly. Sarah felt a moment of uncertainty about having presumed to include him in her future plans, but the gentle surprise in his voice encouraged her to be honest about her feelings. "I can't imagine doing any of this without you," she said. "You've become such an important part of my life, Jake. I don't want that to change." Jake was silent for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to determine whether she truly meant what she had said. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and careful. "I care about you, Sarah, more than I probably should, considering how different our lives are. But I'm not the kind of man who makes pretty speeches or grand romantic gestures. I show how I feel through what I do, not what I say." "I know," Sarah replied. "That's exactly why your feelings mean so much to me. Anyone can say beautiful words, but you've shown me every day for months that you care through your actions." The conversation was interrupted by Rex, who had been patiently waiting in Jake's truck and now appeared in the doorway of the clinic, apparently deciding that his human had been inside long enough. The dog's presence provided a moment of levity that eased the emotional tension of the moment. "Looks like someone's ready to head home," Jake said, reaching down to scratch Rex behind the ears. As they prepared to leave the clinic, Jake paused near the door, seeming to wrestle with something he wanted to say. Finally, he turned back to Sarah with an expression that was both vulnerable and determined. "I'm not good with fancy words," he said quietly. "Never have been. But I want you to know that having you in my life has made everything better. You make me want to be the man you deserve." The simplicity and sincerity of his statement moved Sarah more deeply than any elaborate declaration of love could have. In a world full of people who used impressive language to disguise shallow feelings, Jake's straightforward honesty was both refreshing and powerful. "You already are that man," Sarah said softly. "You've been showing me who you are for months, Jake. I've been falling in love with your actions long before I understood what was happening." For the first time since Sarah had known him, Jake's carefully controlled composure seemed to crack slightly. The emotion in his weathered face was unmistakable, though he still struggled to find words adequate to express what he was feeling. "I love you too," he said finally, the words coming out quietly but with absolute conviction. "Have for months now, but didn't know if someone like you could love someone like me." Sarah stepped closer to him, reaching up to touch his face gently. "Someone like me needs someone exactly like you," she said. "Strong, steady, reliable, and real. I've spent years looking for love in all the wrong places, expecting it to announce itself with fireworks and drama. But real love isn't dramatic, is it? It's quiet and consistent and grows stronger every day." Jake covered her hand with his own, his eyes reflecting a depth of feeling that his reserved nature had previously kept hidden. "Real love is wanting to fix someone's broken door," he said with a slight smile, "and knowing they'd do the same for you." In that moment, Sarah understood that Jake's simple words contained more genuine emotion and commitment than all the elaborate proposals and romantic speeches she had ever heard. His love wasn't performed for an audience or designed to impress. It was simply offered as a steady foundation upon which they could build a future together. As they stood in the clinic that represented both Sarah's professional dreams and the place where their relationship had slowly developed, both understood that they had found something rare and valuable. Their love story wouldn't be one for movies or romance novels, filled with dramatic declarations and grand gestures. Instead, it would be built on the solid foundation of mutual respect, practical kindness, and the daily choice to care for each other through actions rather than words. The Cowboy's simple words had indeed meant more than any proposal could have, because they represented the authentic expression of a love that was already demonstrated through months of consistent care and support. In a world that often confused passion with love and drama with depth, Jake and Sarah had discovered that the most meaningful connections are built slowly, honestly, and with the steady determination to show up for each other every day. Their story would continue to unfold in the same quiet, authentic way it had begun, with love expressed through practical service and genuine partnership rather than grand romantic gestures. And, for both of them, that kind of love proved to be exactly what they had been searching for all along. Even when they didn't know how to recognize it, summer brought new challenges to Sarah's veterinary practice, including a series of emergency calls that kept her working long hours. During one particularly exhausting week in July, she had been called out to 3 different ranches for various animal emergencies, leaving her clinic duties to pile up. When she finally returned to her office on Friday evening, she discovered that someone had mowed her overgrown lawn, watered her wilting flower beds, and repaired a broken fence post that had been leaning precariously for weeks. Jake was just finishing up when she pulled into the parking lot, Rex waiting patiently in the shade of his truck. Sarah sat in her car for a moment, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. No one had asked Jake to take care of her property, and she hadn't even mentioned the maintenance issues that had been weighing on her mind. "You didn't need to do all this," she said as she approached him, gesturing toward the neatly trimmed grass and straightened fence. "Place was looking a little rough around the edges," Jake replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "Figured you were too busy taking care of everyone else's animals to worry about yard work." Sarah realized that Jake had been observing her schedule more closely than she'd imagined. The fact that he had noticed her exhaustion and taken action without being asked touched her in a way that surprised her. Most men in her experience offered help after being prompted, but Jake had simply seen a need and quietly filled it. "Let me at least pay you for the time and effort," Sarah insisted. "Can't charge a friend for being neighborly," Jake said, the word friend carrying weight that neither of them had previously acknowledged. That evening, Sarah found herself thinking about Jake's definition of friendship. In her previous relationships, men had expressed their interest through dinner invitations, flowers, or elaborate weekend plans. Jake's approach was entirely different, focused on practical acts of service that made her life easier without expecting anything in return. Their friendship deepened gradually over the following months. Jake began timing his visits to coincide with Sarah's lunch breaks, often arriving with sandwiches from the local deli that he claimed he had ordered too many of. They would sit in the clinic's small break room, sharing simple meals while discussing everything from veterinary techniques to local weather patterns. Jake proved to be an excellent listener, asking thoughtful questions about Sarah's work and remembering details from previous conversations. During one of these informal lunch meetings in late August, Sarah mentioned her frustration with the clinic's outdated computer system that frequently crashed during busy periods. Jake listened carefully as she described the technical problems, occasionally asking questions about specific functions and capabilities. "Computers aren't really my area," he admitted, "but my nephew Danny works in IT over in Austin. Might be worth having him take a look. See if there's something simple that could help." 2 days later, Danny Thompson arrived with a carload of updated equipment and software, explaining that his uncle had described Sarah's situation and wanted to help improve the clinic's efficiency. The young man spent the entire day upgrading Sarah's systems, refusing any payment beyond lunch and gas money for the drive from Austin. "Uncle Jake said you take real good care of animals around here," Danny explained as he worked. "He thinks highly of folks who dedicate their lives to helping others." Sarah was struck by the realization that Jake had spoken about her to his family, describing her work with obvious respect and admiration. The computer upgrade transformed her daily operations, eliminating the frustrations that had been consuming hours of her time each week. When she tried to thank Jake for arranging the help, he simply shrugged off her gratitude. Danny needed the practice, and you needed the upgrade. Worked out for everyone. As autumn arrived, Sarah noticed that Jake had begun sharing more personal information during their conversations. He mentioned his late wife, Mary, who had passed away from cancer 5 years earlier, and talked about the challenges of running the ranch alone. Sarah learned that Jake had no children of his own but was deeply involved in the lives of his 3 nephews and 2 nieces, serving as a father figure since his brother's death in a car accident several years earlier. "Family's important," Jake said one afternoon as they watched Rex play with a tennis ball in the clinic's small yard. Not just blood family, but the people who show up when you need them. Sarah began to understand that Jake's devotion to helping others wasn't limited to her clinic. He regularly assisted elderly neighbors with property maintenance, volunteered at the local fire department, and contributed both time and money to various community organizations. His acts of service weren't romantic gestures specifically directed at her, but rather expressions of a character that valued practical kindness above personal recognition. The realization was both humbling and illuminating. Sarah had been unconsciously waiting for Jake to declare romantic interest in some conventional way, but his approach to relationships was apparently as understated as everything else about him. Instead of pursuing her with obvious romantic intentions, he had simply made himself consistently available and helpful, allowing their friendship to develop naturally without pressure or expectations. This understanding coincided with a period of personal reflection for Sarah. Her previous relationships had often been marked by early passion that gradually faded as she discovered incompatibilities with partners who initially seemed perfect. With Jake, the pattern was reversed. Her appreciation for him had grown steadily as she observed his character in action, leading to a deeper attraction based on genuine admiration rather than superficial charm. The turning point came during the first week of October, when Sarah received an emergency call about a barn fire at the Henderson Ranch. Several horses were trapped inside the burning building, and the local fire department needed veterinary assistance for the animals they managed to rescue. Sarah grabbed her emergency kit and drove quickly to the scene, where she found chaos and confusion as firefighters worked to control the blaze. Jake was already there, helping to move frightened horses to safety while simultaneously organizing other volunteers to establish a temporary holding area away from the smoke and flames. He worked with calm efficiency, directing traffic and coordinating efforts without seeming to take charge of anyone else's responsibilities. Sarah watched him for a moment before focusing on her own duties, treating horses for smoke inhalation and minor burns. The emergency lasted most of the night, with Sarah and Jake working side by side to care for the rescued animals. At one point, Jake appeared beside her with a thermos of coffee and a warm jacket, having noticed that she was shivering in the cold autumn air. He didn't interrupt her work or ask if she needed anything. He simply provided what was obviously needed and quietly returned to his own tasks. As dawn broke and the immediate crisis passed, Sarah found herself sitting on the tailgate of Jake's truck, exhausted but satisfied that all the animals would recover fully. Jake sat beside her, equally tired but alert as he continued to monitor the scene for any additional needs. "You were amazing tonight," Sarah said, finally, acknowledging what she had observed throughout the emergency. "You seemed to know exactly what needed to be done and how to make it happen." "Experience teaches you to stay calm when things get complicated," Jake replied. Panic never helped anyone, human or animal. Sarah realized that Jake's steady presence during the crisis had been exactly what she needed, providing support and stability without interfering with her professional responsibilities. In contrast to previous boyfriends who had either avoided her work emergencies or tried to take over situations they didn't understand, Jake had simply adapted to the circumstances and focused on being genuinely helpful. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done," Sarah said, gesturing broadly to encompass not just the night's events but months of quiet assistance. Jake was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the now secure ranch as the morning sun began to warm the air. When he finally spoke, his words were simple but carried the weight of months of unspoken feelings. "Don't need thanks for caring about someone," he said quietly. "When you find people worth caring about, helping them isn't a burden. It's a privilege." The sincerity in his voice made Sarah's heart skip, though Jake continued looking straight ahead rather than meeting her eyes. In that moment, she understood that his consistent presence and helpfulness weren't just neighborly kindness, but rather his way of expressing feelings that ran much deeper than friendship. For the first time since they'd met, Sarah saw past Jake's reserved exterior to recognize the depth of emotion he kept carefully controlled. His love language wasn't words or grand gestures, but rather the steady demonstration of care through actions that made her life better and easier. The morning sun climbed higher as they sat in comfortable silence, both understanding that something significant had shifted between them without needing to analyze or define it immediately. Sarah felt a sense of peace and security that she had never experienced in previous relationships, based not on exciting uncertainty but rather on the reliable strength of Jake's character. As the emergency response wound down and other volunteers began to leave, Jake helped Sarah load her equipment into her truck. Their movements were synchronized after months of working together, each anticipating what the other needed without discussion. The ease of their partnership felt natural and right in ways that Sarah hadn't expected to find with someone so different from her usual type. Sarah Martinez had always believed that love would announce itself with grand gestures and perfect timing. At 28, she worked as a veterinarian in the small town of Cedar Creek, Texas, where everyone knew everyone else's business. Her friends constantly teased her about being too picky when it came to men, but Sarah held firm to her romantic ideals, shaped by movies and novels. The autumn morning when Jake Thompson first walked into her clinic changed everything, though she didn't realize it at the time. He stood in the doorway, hat in hand, with an injured border collie named Rex cradled carefully in his arms. His weathered hands spoke of years spent working outdoors, and his quiet demeanor suggested a man who chose his words carefully. "Ma'am, my dog got caught in some barbed wire," Jake said simply, his voice carrying the gentle drawl typical of Texas ranchers. "He's bleeding pretty bad, and I was hoping you could help him." Sarah immediately focused on Rex, whose leg had several deep cuts that would need stitches. As she worked, Jake stood silently beside the examination table, occasionally stroking his dog's head with surprising tenderness for such rough-looking hands. Most pet owners peppered her with anxious questions during procedures, but Jake simply watched and trusted her expertise. "He's going to be fine," Sarah assured him as she finished the last stitch. "Keep the wounds clean and dry for the next week, and bring him back if you notice any signs of infection." Jake nodded, carefully lifting Rex from the table. "Thank you, Doc. What do I owe you?" After settling the bill, he paused at the door. "Rex, and I appreciate your kindness. If you ever need anything fixed around here, just call the Triple T Ranch. I'm good with my hands when it comes to repairs." Sarah smiled politely, thinking she'd probably never see him again. Cedar Creek had dozens of ranchers, and most only brought their animals to town when absolutely necessary. But 3 weeks later, Jake returned with Rex for a follow-up appointment she hadn't even scheduled. "Wanted to make sure he was healing properly," Jake explained, though Rex appeared to be in perfect health. During the brief visit, Sarah noticed Jake's eyes scanning the clinic's waiting room, taking in the worn furniture and outdated magazines. "This place could use some work," he observed quietly. "That chair leg looks loose, and your front door sticks something awful." Sarah laughed. "The landlord keeps promising to fix things, but you know how that goes. I've gotten used to wrestling with the door. Mind if I take a look? I brought my tools, just in case." Before Sarah could protest, Jake was already examining the problematic door. Within an hour, he had repaired the chair, adjusted the door hinges, and fixed a leaky faucet in the back room that had been dripping for months. He refused any payment, simply tipping his hat as he left with Rex. This pattern continued over the following months. Jake would find reasons to visit the clinic, always with some small repair project in mind. He replaced burned-out light fixtures, sealed gaps around windows, and even built custom shelving for Sarah's medical supplies. Each visit was brief and purposeful, with Jake speaking only when necessary but always asking thoughtful questions about her work. Sarah began to look forward to these unexpected visits, though she couldn't quite explain why. Jake wasn't the type of man who usually caught her attention. He was older than her by at least 8 years, quiet to the point of seeming distant, and completely different from the articulate, ambitious men she typically dated. Yet something about his steady presence and genuine helpfulness appealed to her in ways she hadn't expected. The other ranchers who brought animals to the clinic often treated Sarah with a mixture of respect and mild flirtation, but Jake's interactions remained consistently professional and respectful. He never lingered unnecessarily or made personal comments, which somehow made his visits more intriguing rather than less. During the Christmas season, Sarah's clinic became busier than usual as pet owners prepared for holiday travels and year-end checkups. The old heating system struggled to keep up with the December cold, and Sarah often worked wearing her coat. When Jake arrived for Rex's routine vaccination, he immediately noticed her discomfort. "Heater giving you trouble?" he asked, though the answer was obvious. "The repair company can't come out until after New Year's," Sarah explained, rubbing her hands together for warmth. "I'm managing with space heaters, but they're not very efficient." Jake spent nearly an hour examining the heating system, tracing pipes, and checking connections. By the time he finished, warm air was flowing steadily through the vents for the first time in weeks. Sarah tried to insist on paying him for the repair, but Jake simply shook his head. "Can't charge a lady for staying warm," he said, gathering his tools. "Besides, Rex gets better care when his dock isn't freezing." As winter progressed into spring, Sarah found herself genuinely disappointed on weeks when Jake didn't appear. Their conversations remained brief and focused on practical matters, but she began to appreciate his thoughtful observations and dry sense of humor. When he mentioned that Rex was getting older and might benefit from regular checkups, Sarah readily agreed to see them monthly. During one of these visits in early April, Sarah was struggling to move a heavy cabinet that blocked access to a wall outlet she needed to reach. Without being asked, Jake simply stepped forward and relocated the furniture with ease. As he worked, Sarah noticed the careful way he handled everything in her clinic, treating her equipment and space with the same respect he showed his own property. "You're awfully handy to have around," Sarah commented, immediately regretting the casual tone that seemed too personal for their typical interactions. Jake paused in his work, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I like fixing things," he said finally. "Makes me feel useful." Something in his voice suggested there was more to that statement than appeared on the surface, but before Sarah could respond, the bell on the front door announced another patient's arrival. Jake quietly finished moving the cabinet and left with Rex, as he always did, but Sarah found herself thinking about his words for the rest of the day. The relationship between Sarah and Jake had developed into something comfortable and reliable, though neither of them had acknowledged it as anything more than neighborly friendship. Jake's presence had become such a regular part of Sarah's routine that she barely questioned why a successful rancher would spend so much time maintaining a veterinary clinic that wasn't even his responsibility. Their dynamic shifted subtly one afternoon in late spring when Sarah was dealing with a particularly difficult case involving a horse with colic. The animal belonged to the Weatherby Ranch, and old Tom Weatherby was beside himself with worry as Sarah worked to stabilize his prize mare. The treatment required several hours of careful monitoring, and Sarah was exhausted by the time the horse was out of immediate danger. Jake arrived for Rex's appointment just as Tom was loading his recovered mare into a trailer, effusive with gratitude and relief. Sarah, still wearing her surgical scrubs and looking drained from the intense procedure, managed a tired smile as she greeted them. "Rough day?" Jake asked quietly, taking in her appearance. "Long day," Sarah corrected, "but a good outcome, which makes it worthwhile." Jake nodded thoughtfully. "You care about these animals like they were your own family." "I suppose I do," Sarah admitted. "Sometimes I think I care too much. It makes the hard cases even harder." "Nothing wrong with caring," Jake said. "World needs more people who give their whole heart to their work." The sincerity in his voice caught Sarah off guard. In all their months of interaction, Jake had never made such a personal observation about her character. She found herself really looking at him for perhaps the first time, noticing the genuine admiration in his weathered face. "Thank you," she said softly. "That means more than you might think." Jake simply nodded and proceeded with Rex's routine examination, but something had changed in that moment. The foundation was being laid for a connection neither of them fully understood yet, built not on dramatic declarations or romantic gestures, but on steady appreciation and mutual respect.